At 8:15 on a Thursday morning, my neighbor knocked on my car window while I was still in my own driveway, and the look on his face told me everything had already gone wrong before I even knew anything was happening. His name is Murray. He is 73 years old, a retired mail carrier who has lived across the street from us for 19 years. Murray is the kind of man who waves when you wave and minds his business when you're not waving, and he had never once in 19 years walked across the street uninvited. So when I rolled down the window and saw him, pale, jaw tight, eyes that had not slept, my stomach dropped before he said a single word. "Something happened at your house Tuesday night," he said. "I heard Norma screaming. I called 911 and then I kept trying your cell, but it went straight to voicemail. The police came. She's at Riverside Hospital." He stopped, put both hands on the roof of my car. "They told me she's okay, but you need to go there now, Hugh. Right now." My name is Hugh Granger. I am 64 years old. I spent 38 years as a licensed pharmacist in Columbus, Ohio, working a career built on precision, on understanding that a half-milligram difference in the wrong direction can mean the difference between healing and harm. I retired 2 years ago with a clean record, a good pension, and the quiet certainty of a man who has measured things carefully his whole life. I had come home that morning from a 3-day pharmaceutical conference in Denver, dropped my bag in the trunk, and was about to head inside when Murray knocked on my window. I had no idea my wife had been alone in this house for 2 days, with something that had already happened to her. I did not park the car properly. I remember leaving it half in the driveway and running, and Murray calling after me that it was Riverside on Henderson Road, and then getting back in the car and not being able to remember for 3 full seconds where Henderson Road was, even though I had driven it probably 400 times. Norma had been admitted Tuesday night with a fractured wrist and a deep contusion along her left temple. The doctor told me this in a hallway that smelled of floor cleaner and recycled air, in the flat tone that medical professionals use when they are delivering difficult information to someone still trying to process that any information is being delivered at all. She had been found on the kitchen floor. She was conscious when the paramedics arrived. She had been asking for me. I stood in that hallway and pressed my hand against the wall and breathed. Then a man in a plain gray jacket stepped out of the room behind the doctor and introduced himself as Detective Reese, Columbus PD. He was in his mid-40s, with patient eyes that didn't miss much, and he held a small notebook loosely in one hand the way some people carry their phones, reflexively, without thinking about it. He asked me where I had been since Tuesday morning. He asked it calmly and without hostility, but there was a quality in the question, a careful deliberateness, that told me he wasn't asking out of routine courtesy. I told him about the conference, Denver, the Marriott on Stout Street, my name badge, my itinerary, the hotel key I still had in my jacket pocket, 310 miles away for 72 hours, with a paper trail anyone could verify in 20 minutes. He wrote something down. Then he told me that before I went in to see my wife, there were a few things he needed to establish. Standard procedure. He understood I wanted to see her. He'd make it as brief as possible. I said, "Fine, whatever you need." He walked me to a small consultation room at the end of the hall, and I sat across from him at a table that was slightly too tall for the chairs. The way tables in those rooms always seem arranged, as if the furniture itself is designed to keep you slightly off balance. Then he reached into the folder in front of him and pulled out a single printed page and placed it between us. It was an email. 3 paragraphs, typed and formatted, dated 4 days earlier. It described what the author called escalating volatility in my behavior at home over the past 8 months. It listed specific dates. A morning in March when I had allegedly thrown a coffee mug against the kitchen wall. An evening in June when I had supposedly locked Norma out of the bedroom and refused to speak to her for hours. A Sunday in September when a neighbor had reportedly heard shouting from our backyard. I had never done any of those things. I read it twice, then I looked at the sender name in the header. My son-in-law had written it. He had sent it to Detective Reese's department email address 48 hours before Norma was found on the kitchen floor. I set the paper down. I pressed both hands flat on the tabletop. I was 64 years old, and I had spent my career understanding that the moment you lose your composure in a high-stakes situation is the moment you lose everything else. I breathed through my nose until the heat behind my eyes settled into something I could work with. "Detective Reese," I said, "I would like you to look at that email very carefully. Look at the level of preparation. Look at the specific dates. And then I want you to ask yourself whether a worried family member sends that kind of documentation to a police detective before something happens or after." He studied me. He wrote something down. Then he told me I was free to go see my wife. Norma was in room 214, her left arm in a temporary splint, a white bandage at her temple. When I opened the door, she turned her head, and what I saw in her face in that first half second was something I am going to carry for the rest of my life. Just for a moment, just one involuntary fraction of a second, her body pulled back against the pillow. Her good hand found the bed rail. Then recognition came flooding back in. "Hugh," she said, and she started to cry. Not quietly. The kind of crying that happens when something you have been holding at arm's length for too long finally comes through every wall at once. I crossed the room and took her good hand in both of mine, and she squeezed my fingers until my knuckles ached, and I was grateful for the pain because it was real and it was ours. "He told me you weren't coming back," she said between breaths. "He said you'd found out about the account and you were furious. He said you'd been drinking. I told him that was insane. You don't even drink." And then everything happened very fast. I sat on the edge of her bed and held on, and let her tell me the rest in pieces. My son-in-law had arrived at the house on Tuesday afternoon. He said my daughter Wendy had sent him to check in, because she hadn't been able to reach me. He seemed agitated in a way that didn't match the explanation. He went straight to my home office, without being invited, and began going through the filing cabinet where I keep property documents, retirement account statements, the deed to the house. Norma told him to stop. He said he was only trying to help, that we were getting older and someone needed to understand the full financial picture. She asked him to leave. He got louder. She said she was calling Wendy. He moved between her and the phone. She didn't remember everything that happened next. She remembered the floor. I pressed her hand against my jaw and said nothing for a long time. Outside the window, the October sky was flat and gray and completely indifferent to what was happening in room 214. I am not a man who cries easily. I never have been. But sitting there on the edge of my wife's hospital bed with her bandaged wrist in my hands, something came through behind my eyes that I did not try to stop. I let it come, and I let it pass, and then I picked up my phone and called Leland Marsh. Leland is 67, my oldest friend, a retired CPA, who spent 30 years untangling the financial records of people and companies that did not want them untangled. We met coaching our daughter's Little League teams when the girls were 9 years old. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I knew. I told him about the email, the filing cabinet, what Norma had said. He was quiet for a moment. Not hesitation, the particular pause of a man organizing what he already suspects into the order he needs to say it. Then he said, "Hugh, how much do you know about what's been going on with his business?" I told him not much. My son-in-law ran a private contracting company. He'd always seemed fine, busy. Leland said he'd make some calls, come over in the morning, and bring whatever documents I could access. We'd start at the beginning. The next morning, before I drove to Leland's, I stopped at Murray's front door. He opened it before I finished knocking, which told me he had been waiting for me. His living room was crowded with the comfortable accumulation of a long life, bookshelves, framed photographs, a gray tabby cat asleep on the arm of the sofa, and on the coffee table he had set up a laptop that was already open. He had already pulled the footage. "I've had that system for 4 years," he said. "Motion activated, covers the full width of the street." The timestamp in the upper right corner of the screen read 2:47 p.m., Tuesday, October 8th. My son-in-law's white pickup truck pulled onto our street and parked 2 houses past ours, facing away from the house. Not in our driveway, not in front. 2 houses down on the far side, where a camera mounted at our front door angle would have had trouble capturing the plate. He knew about the front door camera. He'd helped me install it. At 5:18 p.m., he came out the front door carrying a bag over his shoulder. A dark canvas bag I recognized as the one I kept emergency property documents in. The deed, the insurance policies, the retirement account summaries. The bag was full enough that he adjusted the strap twice coming down the porch steps. He turned right, walked past his own truck, and got into a silver sedan that had been parked on the next block. It pulled away without turning on its headlights until it reached the stop sign. Murray had made 3 copies of the footage. One for me, one for himself, and one already delivered to his attorney for safekeeping. I sat in Murray's living room and watched that timestamp, and felt the particular cold clarity of a man who has been standing in the middle of something for a while and is only now seeing its full shape. Leland's findings took 12 hours. He called me at 9:30 that night. My son-in-law's contracting business had been bleeding money for over 2 years. 3 failed bids on commercial projects. A civil lawsuit from a subcontractor he'd stiffed on a job in Westerville, and a personal loan of $290,000 from a private lender registered in Nevada. No bank affiliation, no FDIC oversight, the kind of entity that occupies the space between legal private lending and what any reasonable person would simply call predatory. The interest rate was 19% compounded monthly. The current outstanding balance as of that week was $341,000. The deadline for full repayment was 18 days away. Our house was appraised at $480,000. We had paid it off 7 years ago. Leland kept going. 6 weeks earlier, my son-in-law had made contact with a real estate agent who specialized in off-market residential sales, cash transactions, no MLS listing, no public record of the buyer, until the deed transfer filed with the county. The agent already had a preliminary offer in hand, $310,000, cash. No title search, no contingencies, no questions. That was what was in the filing cabinet. That was what he had come for. And then Leland said something that made me stand up from the kitchen table without meaning to. 8 weeks ago, he said, a home equity line of credit had been opened against our property at First Federal Savings in the amount of $150,000. The application had been submitted by someone presenting documentation showing that Norma Granger had authorized the loan as the sole applicant. The application had been notarized. Norma had been visiting her sister in Cincinnati the week that application was submitted. I stood in my kitchen at 9:45 at night, with the phone pressed against my ear, and felt the specific, settling weight of a man who has finally understood the full size of the structure he is standing inside. He didn't just want the house, I said. My voice came out very quiet. No, Leland said. He needed the $150,000 to buy time while he arranged the full sale. He needed the sale to clear the debt, and he needed Norma injured and you implicated before either transaction could be questioned. He had sent the email to the detective first, to establish the narrative. Then he had gone to the house. The silence on the phone lasted a long time. I have someone for you, Leland said. Her name is Ramona Whitfield. She handles elder financial abuse and real estate fraud. She's the best in Columbus, and she is going to want to see everything I just showed you. Ramona Whitfield's office was on the 14th floor of a building on High Street, and she had the quality of a person who has heard a great many devastating things and has organized all of that experience into a kind of focused precision that leaves no room for anything unnecessary, including reassurance she can't back up yet. She reviewed everything in 90 minutes. The camera footage, the debt records Leland had documented, the HELOC application with the forged notarization, the email sent to the detective, the preliminary contact with the off-market agent. Then she stood and went to the whiteboard on the far wall. Ohio Revised Code 291302, she said. Theft. Ohio Revised Code 291331, forgery. The HELOC application alone is 3 separate felony counts. The forged notarization implicates both the notary and the applicant. And the moment that $150,000 moved through federal banking channels to an account in my son-in-law's name as part of a scheme to defraud, it became wire fraud under Title 18, Section 1343. 20 years per count, federal. She looked at me over her glasses. Then there is Norma's injury. She said it the same way she had said everything else, clearly without hedging. Under Ohio law, physical harm to a person 60 or older in the course of a theft offense carries mandatory sentencing enhancements. Norma is 61. She capped the marker. I need an emergency asset freeze filed today, she said, so that no transaction involving your property can move forward while we build the full case. And I need you to be steady through this. Not angry, not reactive. Steady. Can you do that? I thought about 38 years behind a pharmacy counter. The steadiness of hands that understand the stakes of what they are holding. Yes, I said, I can do that. Before I reveal what Leland found in those account transfers, something so deliberate, so coldly calculated, it stopped me from breathing when I read it. Drop the number 64 in the comments right now, so I know you're still with me. Every single one of you means more than you know. And a note, some details in this story have been adjusted to protect those involved, but the core of what happened is real, and the lesson inside it is worth keeping. The family meeting was my daughter's idea. She called me 10 days after Norma came home from the hospital, her voice careful in the way it gets when she's been holding two things in opposite directions for too long. She said her husband had asked to speak to everyone, family, a few close friends, and that he wanted to explain. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said people needed to hear his side. I told her to let him have the meeting. She was quiet for a moment. Dad, she said, do you know something I don't? I told her to trust me, and I asked her to make sure Murray could come. We gathered in our living room on a Sunday afternoon. Norma sat beside me on the couch, her arms still in a brace. Murray was near the window. Leland was in the armchair by the bookcase. My daughter's Aunt Bea had driven up from Dayton. Ramona had told me what to place on the coffee table before anyone arrived, and I had done it. The folder, closed, sitting there like something that already knew what it contained. My son-in-law arrived last, and he had dressed for this. A button-down shirt pressed, a recent haircut, the look of a man who has been rehearsing in his bathroom mirror. He moved through the room, touching shoulders, clasping hands, saying exactly the right things to each person, warm without being excessive, concerned without being dramatic. I watched him work the space with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this kind of thing enough times to know which register of voice lands best in a room that size. He positioned himself near the fireplace, which was the natural center of the room, and he began. He talked about love. He talked about family. He talked about pressure and bad decisions made in desperation, and how much he regretted the things that had happened. He did not mention $341. He did not mention Nevada. He did not mention the off-market real estate agent or the canvas bag or the car that waited with its headlights off 2 blocks from our house. He used the word love 8 times in 4 minutes. I counted. I let him finish. Then I opened the folder. I placed the first item on the coffee table, a printed still from Murray's security camera. Timestamp 5:18 p.m., Tuesday, October 8th. My son-in-law on our front porch with the canvas bag adjusted over his shoulder, heading toward a car that had been waiting and running 2 blocks away. This is my son-in-law, I said, leaving this house with our property documents on the afternoon my wife was injured. He told the police he had not been here since the previous weekend. No one spoke. I placed the second item, Leland's documentation of the private debt, the Nevada lender, the compounding interest, the $341,000 outstanding, the deadline that had passed. I said nothing. I let them read. Third item, the HELOC application, the notarized signature, the date cross-referenced against Norma's travel records, showing she had been in Cincinnati that entire week. Aunt Bea pressed her hand over her mouth. Fourth item, the email sent to Detective Reese's department address 48 hours before Norma was found on the kitchen floor, describing incidents of domestic volatility that had never occurred. My son-in-law's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth. I am not finished, I said. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the table. I placed the last item, the preliminary contact with the off-market agent, $310,000 cash, no questions, no title search. This is why, I said simply. This is what all of it was for. He tried. I will give him that. He turned to the room, to Aunt Bea, to Murray, to Leland, looking for anyone who might still be persuadable. He said he had only been trying to help, that he was scared for us, that things had spiraled beyond anything he intended, that he was asking for understanding. My daughter stood up. She was 3 feet from her husband, and her voice, when it came, was the steadiest thing in the room. You told me, she said, that my father had been erratic, that my mother was frightened of him. You told me that on 4 separate phone calls over the past 3 months, and each time I tried to call her, she said everything was fine. She paused. Her hands were pressed flat at her sides. I told Aunt Bea that Dad had seemed different lately, because you told me to. She looked at him the way you look at something you are in the process of no longer recognizing. My mother's wrist is broken. The room held that. Then my son-in-law turned to me. For the first time since he had walked through our front door, he looked at me directly, and what I saw in his face was not remorse. It was the look of a man who has just realized that the road he has been running down for a long time has ended, and there is nothing on the other side. Detective Reese arrived at 2:43 p.m. He came in calmly with a colleague, the way people come in when they have already coordinated and know exactly where they are going. My son-in-law heard the door open and turned around, and the color left his face in the specific way that color leaves when the body understands something the mind is still refusing to. Reese read him his rights in an unhurried, even voice. He did not say anything. He stood in our living room in his pressed shirt and held out his wrists and allowed the handcuffs to be applied with the compliance of someone who has completely run out of moves. He did not look at my daughter. When they walked him through the front door, Norma reached over and took my hand without saying a word. I held on. Murray sat with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed. Leland went to the kitchen without being asked and came back with glasses of water. Aunt Bea was crying quietly. My daughter stood at the window for a long time. I let her stand. After a few minutes, she turned around and her eyes were dry in the way that eyes go dry on the far side of something too lush for tears. And she crossed the room and took my hand, and I pulled her in and held her the way you hold someone when love and grief have become the same weight in the same moment. The federal wire fraud charge meant Reese coordinated with the FBI field office in Columbus. Ramona described the case as the cleanest elder fraud prosecution she had handled in 12 years. Every transaction documented, every transfer timestamped, the forged notary already cooperating in exchange for a reduced charge of her own. My son-in-law pleaded guilty to 4 counts in March: elder financial abuse under Ohio statute, forgery, wire fraud under federal law, felonious assault for Norma's wrist and the contusion at her temple, which carried a mandatory sentencing enhancement because Norma had just turned 61. The judge sentenced him to 11 years. She noted from the bench that the level of premeditation involved, the email sent to the detective before the incident, the prearranged buyer, the forged loan application, the manufactured documentation of domestic violence, indicated not a crime of desperation, but a sustained course of deliberate action against people who had trusted him completely. She brought the gavel down once. The sound of it moved through my chest like something settling into place. Ramona shook my hand outside the courtroom. Leland was waiting by the elevator. Detective Reese gave me a nod from across the hall, a single, wordless nod that carried everything it needed to carry. My daughter stood beside me through all of it, right where she was supposed to be. She filed for divorce the same week as the sentencing. She told me she had seen things over the past year, small things she had explained away because she'd loved him, and because it is always easier to explain things away than to look at them clearly. She said she was done explaining things away. I told her that was the only thing she needed to tell me. The house on Birchwood Avenue looks different to me now than it did a year ago. Not worse. Different. The oak in the front yard has dropped its leaves and the light comes in at a November angle, and some mornings I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee and look at the driveway and think about the canvas bag and the car with no headlights and the email that was written 2 days before everything. I think about it, and then I let it pass. Norma's wrist healed clean. She does her stretches every morning while the coffee brews, and she complains about the joint in cold weather, and those complaints are the most ordinary and welcome sounds in the world to me. My daughter comes on Sundays. She brings food, and she and Norma sit at the kitchen table and talk in the easy way of people who have nothing left between them that needs to be managed. Sometimes I sit with them. Sometimes I take my coffee out to the porch and just let the sound of their voices carry through the screen door, and that is enough. That is more than enough. Murray waves from across the street. I wave back, every morning. There are people who stood with us through the worst of this. Leland, who spent 12 hours running down a trail of debt and transfers without being asked why. Murray, who called 911 for a woman he barely knew because the right thing was plain, and he simply did it. Ramona, who turned a folder of documents into a case that held in front of a federal judge. And my daughter, who stood in our living room and told her husband the truth about what he had done, while her mother's wrist was still in a brace. I did not choose any of them carefully. They chose themselves when it mattered, without waiting to be asked. I want to say something honest about my son-in-law, not in defense of what he did, because there is no defense for it, but in honesty about what it costs to look across a holiday table at a person for 6 years and finally understand that the warmth you saw was a performance, and that the performance was always in service of something you were never supposed to discover. That costs something permanent. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But here is what I know. I am 64 years old. My wife is in the kitchen right now. My daughter will be here Sunday. My friend Leland is coming Thursday to watch the game. Everything worth keeping is still here. Some things cannot be taken, not because they are hidden or locked away, but because they were never the kind of thing that a canvas bag and a car with no headlights can carry out a front door. If you have parents who are getting older, go see them. Not because something is wrong. Go see them so you know what right looks like, and so they know that someone is paying attention. The people who love us most are almost never the ones who ask for help, and the people who want to hurt them are counting on that silence. Check on each other. That's all I know how to say.